Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this online panel discussion from the Center for Geopolitics of the University of Cambridge. I'm Quinchen Lin, the Deputy Director of the Center. I'm going to be the moderator for today's hour-long panel on Hong Kong's future under China's national security law. On June this year, June 30th, the National People's Congress of China unanimously passed a new national security law for Hong Kong. The formulation and discussion of the law were in secret, bypassing Hong Kong's local legislature and public consultation. The law contains broad powers and harsh penalties. Virtually anything could be deemed a threat to national security under its provisions, and it can apply to anyone in and outside of Hong Kong. Under this new law, quote unquote, secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces incur maximum penalties for life sentences. Trials can be held in secret and without jury. Judges can be handpicked by Hong Kong's chief executive, who is answerable directly to Beijing. And suspects could be taken to China for trial, which means that they could be held outside the formal detention system for undefined periods. Naturally, many are expecting the worst in consequences on human rights, freedom of press and academia, and rule of law. Indeed, the first months of the implementation of this law has largely confirmed this expectation, with arrests of pro-democracy leaders, severe restrictions on political messages, and government demands on user data from major online platforms. The UN has expressed concerns that the law might result in criminalization and restrictions of fundamental freedoms protected by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It also has stated that the vague and overly broad definitions of some offenses in the new law might lead to discriminatory and arbitrary interpretation and enforcement of the law, which could undermine human rights protection. There's a widespread consensus among legal experts that China's national security law has ended the territory's legal autonomy under the one country, two systems framework, which was agreed upon in the Sino-British Joint Declaration in preparation for the 1997 handover. So there's a violation of international treaties here as well. So today's panel, we will discuss the significance of the timing of the introduction of the national security law and the extent, impact, and potential reach of the law. We hope to gain a better understanding of the ongoing and likely future social responses from pro-democracy individuals and groups, and also from other stakeholders in this one country, two systems framework, including current responses from foreign governments. We're very fortunate today to have four eminent panelists who for decades have contributed to our understanding of democratization, politics, and social movement in Hong Kong and Asia more broadly. We have Professor Johannes Man-Moon Chan, who's the Chair Professor of Public Law at Hong Kong University. We have Isabel Hilton, London-based author and broadcaster. We have Dr. Yi-Chun Lai, who's the president of the Prospect Foundation in Taiwan, and Charles Parton, Senior Associate Fellow of the Royal United Services Institute. So we will start with a discussion by asking our legal scholar, Johannes, on the timing of the introduction of the national security law. Why now? Why the urgency? The pro-democracy demonstrations have been ongoing for months, largely peaceful and admirably self-disciplined, and would have likely been reduced in scale due to the coronavirus lockdown. So it seems rather puzzling that Xi Jinping has decided to risk further protests in introducing the law. Do you think Beijing is motivated by its assessment of a lack of success of containment of widespread demonstrations? Professor Chen?
I think the only things that is outside Beijing's contemplation is the COVID-19. The rest, indeed, you can find from what has happened in the last 10 years or so. I think we can trace it back to almost the turn of the turn of the decade here. If we go back to Deng Xiaoping times, Hong Kong served two purposes. One is economic, to help China's modernization, and second is political, which is a reunification of Hong Kong with China, a political mission of great importance to any Chinese leaders. Now, as time passes, the economic function of Hong Kong has either been served or spent. So when it comes to Xi Jinping, the political function becomes more important. We can see the rise of nationalism. China is going to stand out in the world again, so sovereignty becomes more important. The sovereignty of China as a country, as a master, is gaining weight. So we see that in the 2010, for example, or back in the Occupy Central time, the white paper, they emphasize and comprehensive jurisdictions, no residual power, China retain oversight, and then you see the disqualification of the legislator. Again, China asserts its jurisdiction irrespective of the case being heard by the court. So I think in a way it's consistent with that trend. You can see the trend of increasing central control on Hong Kong, partly to signify that sovereign control, partly China becomes less tolerant of a diverging views in China. And then the more recent event is since Occupy Central, it seems that Hong Kong is increasingly out of control. The SAR government is unable to really hold that, and we can see from extradition's argument to the protest last year. And then what happened is what people have seen, or at least those people who make decisions, what they have seen are images of rioters, images of people committing arsons, putting fire on mainland Chinese, attacking the liaison office. So these things all touch on their very notion of sovereignty. So in that sense, and then against the whole context of US-Sino-British, US-Sino trade war, partly they feel threatened, and then they touch on the long-time problem that China has always been worried that Hong Kong would become a base of counter-revolutionary or base against China. So with all these, I think that the decision in a way is almost a calculated one, and it comes to a point that making use of failure to enact Article 23 law as the pretext and introduce the national security law to reassert the primacy of sovereignty.
Interesting. Charlie, you've paid close attention to elite politics in Zhonglanhai for decades. What's your view on the impact of COVID-19 and the geopolitical pressures on Xi Jinping?
I don't think that COVID is actually that important in the decision to move ahead with the national security law. I think if you look at the fourth plenum, it quite clearly states there that they will, that the national security law must come in Hong Kong. The Chinese, of course, doesn't have a subject to the verb, so it doesn't say who's actually going to do that, whether it's going to be Hong Kong or, as it turned out, the NPC. But it's there very clearly. So I think the thing that really upset them was that over the last year, the three bottom lines, which Deng Xiaoping at the time in charge of Hong Kong policy set out earlier, about no threat to national security, no challenge to the central power or to the authority of the basic law, and no actions to use Hong Kong to infiltrate and harm the mainland, i.e. hostile forces. These were clearly starting to be a great worry to Beijing when it came, and I think it was November that was crucial. After the plenum, they decided they would ensure that this NSL came in at some stage. But in November, you had two things that really stirred them up. One was the district council elections. And that showed that actually the Democrats could mobilize. And this, I think, is the real motivation for introducing the national security law, is to ensure that the LegCo elections of September didn't go the wrong way. Of course, they've now been postponed, but that, I think, was a real crucial issue. We can go into why that is the case. And the second thing was the siege of the Polytechnic in November, which I think saw a degree of violence that and resistance, which the CCP Beijing felt really was beginning to infringe on those three bottom lines. So I think it predated COVID. COVID.
Sorry, we seem to be having a little problem with Charlie's internet. Let's hope we can recover his input in a little bit. Okay, so let me just take this opportunity to just mention to the audience here that we're of course recording this live, and it will be up on our website in a few weeks. But please do submit your questions via the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. And we'll be collecting them, and I'll be sorting through them and directing them to the panelists. So before we get Charlie back, oh, hi.
I seem to be back, I'm moving.
Ah, right.
Apologies.
The hazard of online
Try that, is that better?
Yes, much better. Thank you, Charlie. Please continue.
Well, I think I'd made my points, so others may want to come back on this.
Great. We'll try to come back to some of your observations in a while. Let me move to the idea of societal responses to get a better sense of that. The main concern for most of us of the impact of national security law is, of course, on the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. Isabel, you've been observing the pressures on social movements, and you've spoken with the leaders. What are they thinking, and what are the options for their future activities under this current configuration?
Well, I should say that the risk of being labelled a foreign force, I'm not directly in touch with the leaders at all. But I do, like many others, observe Hong Kong closely. And I agree with what's been said about the timing and the concerns that Beijing has had. My question would be whether this particular move is really going to address those concerns to best effect, but perhaps we'll get on to that later. I also think that I agree with Charlie that the effect of the district elections was pretty critical, because it did two things. It refuted the argument that Carrie Lam liked to make, that there was a silent majority in favor of a tough pro-Beijing line. It also offered an opportunity for the opposition, and therefore a risk for Carrie Lam and for Beijing, that there could, despite the difficulties of Hong Kong's highly constrained franchise, be a real and effective opposition in LegCo, which would be harder to delegitimize. So I think, like a lot of things, it was a combination of both power and opportunity. And I think COVID, I would perhaps slightly push back to Charlie to suggest that COVID was quite important in offering an opportunity in a very distracted world. So, you know, it seemed like a tempting moment. As to what the pro-democracy groups can and will do, well, as you know, pro-democracy covers a very wide spectrum in Hong Kong, from the older generation of pan-democrats through the different generations that have been produced by different phases of this situation, to the very young protesters that we've seen in action in the last year. And what's striking about particularly the last year's operation is how adaptable and how fluid they are. I'm not talking about what I think is a relatively small, more confrontational hardcore, where we've seen violence and regular confrontations at the end of the demonstrations, but surrounding, perhaps separate from that group, I would say that there were a very large number of people who have used the tools available very dynamically and very creatively. And we've seen it even with, in recent days since the passage of the law, days where the dangers of the law have become very evident, I think, to anyone who's been involved in any demonstrations. But if you watch the share price, for example, of Jimmy Lai's company after his arrest, you can see that Hong Kong people are still finding interesting ways to express their views. The formal groups were dissolved almost immediately on the passage of the law, which didn't save people like Agnes Chow from arrest. So I think what we're seeing is the unfolding of the very real risks of protest. We will see how the cases that are currently pending will be handled. But if this is a case of harsh sentencing and very strict application of the law, then I think the days of the kind of protests that we've seen on the streets of Hong Kong are going to be over. And depending on who those democracy leaders are, and as I say, they cover a very wide spectrum, they're going to take a combination of individual and collective decisions. So individuals have already left Hong Kong. And I think it was striking really, you know, young people, when surveyed in Hong Kong in the past few years, have been very pessimistic about Hong Kong's future. And I think many will now see that pessimism confirmed and will seek to make a life elsewhere. As far as how you organize under these circumstances, if you wish to continue to organize, I think that will be very constrained. And it remains to be seen if creative new ways can be developed. But the space for action is now very, very narrow.
Thank you. And we're seeing this as well in academia and the press. So if I could ask Johannes, tell us about the sacking of your colleague, Associate Professor Benny Tai, and apparently moved by the CCP to introduce or impose nationalistic or patriotic education for Hong Kong's youth in the future.
I think certainly in the academia, there is a lot of concern about this national security law and how it would impact us, especially when the new term is going to start very soon. A lot of teaching will be done over Zoom, and both teachers and students are concerned how far they can open and frankly discuss things without being reported on what they have said. We have seen increasing censorship on the use of materials, and a lot of people has put down what they have put on internet and so on. So, and I think that is what the national security law is trying to achieve. On the one hand, yes, there are very broad criminal offenses, etc. Some people will be arrested and will be charged, but I think the major impact is really the chilling effect on people. There is a limit of how many people you can arrest, and the criminal prosecution, the process takes time. And then with all the lawyers in Hong Kong, which they don't like, we have the first national security case coming up to the court tomorrow or on Thursday. And the very first question the court will have to address is, can court give bail? And immediately the provision in the national security law is being challenged already. So these prosecution, etc., resort to criminal law is not very effective. It takes a long time. But I think it will be done in order to sustain that chilling effect. Just telling people every now and then we are going to arrest people. So criminalise, the high-profile search of Apple served that purpose. Arrest of Agnes Chow also served that purpose. And every now and then they would remind the people of Hong Kong that this chilling effect, we are watching, this is going on. But then the chilling effect is because the law is so broad, you don't know how it is going to be implemented. And now you know that the national security people are there, people are watching. So there will be a lot more self-censorship, that people at least are more cautious. And as Isabel said, is the room is more narrow now. And that impacts on a lot of activities. We have seen even secondary school teachers, they are disciplined because of what they said on their personal Facebook. And Benny Tai's event certainly sends also a bad message when Senate, which represents the academic views, decide that there's no good cause made out, and what he did may not be right, but that's not deserve a dismissal. And then you can see council overruling that. So I think the whole atmosphere put together it doesn't look very optimistic. Everyone tries to be very cautious, and partly you simply do not know where the line is to be drawn, and that line seems to be very fluid at the moment.
Charlie, back in 2015, obviously we had the disappearance of Causeway Bay book publishers, and some of whom were later confirmed to be in detention in mainland China. do you think that the significance of arrest of Jimmy Lai and in general the freedom of press restriction on that, is that simply to allow governments to openly take actions, which in the past they might have done by other means? Or is there something more to it?
Yeah, I mean, I'd slightly broaden that in a way. I mean, if you look at the Xia Jianhua case as well, I mean, and the whole extradition, or rather, actually, it's more rendition than extradition debate, that's now, in a sense, been solved. I mean, the whole crisis in Hong Kong restarted this time because of the so-called extradition law. I don't think that's going to be necessary in future because the NSL's provisions, those four provisions, are sufficiently ill-defined and ambiguous, as often is mainland law, that the Communist Party can achieve its aims quite happily with the NSL. So it looks a little bit more legal than it did when they took Xia Jianhua away. So I think that that's one, as it were, problem solved. I mean, I think there are other aspects, if I may slightly broaden it from that. I mean, I agree that another question is the press, and we've talked about that. But I think it's also well worth observing that stuck in the NSL is, and also at the fourth plenum, is a whole article and business of education in Hong Kong. And if you look at the fourth plenum, what it said there was that they would encourage education of the constitution and the basic law, of Chinese history, of Chinese culture, strengthen national consciousness and patriotic spirit, especially among civil servants and the youth. And one of the articles in the NSL is about strengthening patriotic or national education. So that too is coming down the line. And the other question that I think Johannes talked about, which I think is very interesting, we don't yet know in great detail, is how the judiciary is going to react to all this and what further pressures will come upon them. That's not my area. I'm sure others are better able to go into that than I.
We need to pay attention to that indeed. Let me, at this point, perhaps turn to something that Johannes mentioned earlier, which is the political economy aspect of this. So Hong Kong, as we know, is one of the most important nodal point of illicit capital transfer and material sustenance for power exchange relations in a very high level of Chinese politics. So analysts have tied Xi Jinping's political interest in rooting out competing factional power bases to his anti-corruption campaigns and targeting of the white gloves, quote unquote, intermediaries who launder money on behalf of wealthy families. So Xiao Jianhua, the billionaire head of Tomorrow Group, was taken from his room in Four Seasons Hong Kong Hotel in 2017, and his company has since then been dismantled and nationalized, in the process exposing the murky nexus for political and business elites in China. So I want to now turn to Yi Zhong and ask him, Taiwan is in a unique position to understand this sort of authoritarian responses to democratic forces. You direct the Prospect Foundation, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank, influential in informing Taiwanese policymakers on the inner workings of the CCP. So in your view, how will the NSL affect this particular strategic value of Hong Kong to the multiple generation of Communist Party state elites in their wealth accumulation?
Yeah, thank you. And I think for Taiwan, Hong Kong represents several very unique features, especially the way that Xi Jinping passed the NSL. I think the speedy passage of the NSL, which means that, which means to us that probably how worrisome the Xi Jinping is to first the so-called foreign external forces, and second his rivalry within a party. Both of them. The first one, the foreign external forces, to Xi Jinping, seems that he is always worried about the foreign interference through Hong Kong to China. Hong Kong is the only places in China where the June 4th memorial still public held, and some of the so-called democracy values can still public be be breached, but in China that is no longer the case. And with especially after year 2003, the CECA agreement signed between China and Hong Kong, and sending up the Chinese tourists to Hong Kong, which means that there are a good significant number of the Chinese people. They will be able to access those information through their passage or their traveling to Hong Kong, and that seems to us that Xi Jinping is very much worried about the effect of those people when they receive those information from Hong Kong and how they will react back in China. And of course, the Hong Kong always has been thought of as the Jiang Zemin, which basically is a rivalry of the Xi Jinping in terms of elite politics, and Hong Kong has been the stronghold of the Jiang Zemin forces there. And if you look at the, some of the public revelation about the personal wealth in year 2012, some of the reports actually came from Hong Kong. And the way that China did to those Hong Kong reports is to restrict or even sanction about those reporting company and the report right back in China. But basically that reveals how much of the Xi Jinping is to those the report probably they'll be used by his political rivalries in order to insult or shed some of the not so glory lies for the Xi Jinping himself. I will also say that the speedy passage and also the detail of the national security legislation also means that the Xi Jinping probably wanted to pass this this March should the two conferences was held with no delay. If there was no the Wuhan coronaviruses happening. And basically the COVID-19 coronaviruses sort of delay the original scheduled the passage, but it also gave China the opportunity, because look at the way that the Western democracy now is still suffering from the pandemic. China seems to be able to at least walk out from the first attack, and that makes the Chinese the authority within Beijing believe that probably this is the best opportunity they can have. And they just cannot miss the window. So they push for the speedy passage of this national security law. And to Taiwan, another interesting effect was that is that the Hong Kong's economy, the role of the Hong Kong economy probably is no longer viewed by China the same way as it was like year 2010 or year 2012. And that also has the interesting effects about how the Taiwan is thinking about Chinese policy toward Taiwan. The year 2012 or 13, at least people still believe that the China needs to have the capital flow from Hong Kong to China for their sustained economic growth. But if you look at the Chinese plan in year 2017 and 18, by having the so-called, in Chinese word, 大港湾经济区, basically that is to tie Hong Kong with the Shenzhen, with the Guangzhou all together, to have a grand area, which basically reduced Hong Kong just as a city within that special economic zones. And how about the Hong Kong special feature as a global financial hub? And that's part of the characteristic seems to be missing in the design. And that basically tells us how much of the China is thinking about its own economic wealth and economic power, and how its economy connecting with the rest of the world, and Hong Kong's role in it. And we also noticed that following the year 2018, the trade war between China and Hong Kong and United States, it seems to us that the Chinese authority right now started to believe that the kind of the decoupling pressure on China, that is probably something that's inevitable. And there are various statements coming from China about how they have to sustain on their own, how they need to work on their own in order for the economic wealth, and even create a new word that is called the inner circles. That is just let the economy flow through the China, and China proper itself have a less connection with the outside world. And if that is becoming Chinese economic policy, then the Hong Kong's role and the way they look at Hong Kong definitely will be very different from how they look at Hong Kong in the past. And if that is, and judging from that, if China could overly took away, even sweep Hong Kong from its traditional role, as well as the as well as disregarding the international concern about this development, then the that also means that the Chinese position on Taiwan probably will be hardened much more. All the past constraint about probably the China will suffer due to international sanction, whether from the economy, technology, or others, should they attack Taiwan. But by looking at how the Chinese are doing to Hong Kong right now, probably those constraints are no longer that strong in detaining China about taking those actions.
That's a very important point. So what you're suggesting is that actually the barrier to further Chinese assertiveness in the region might have been reduced in this act. So let's come back to this again. Later on, I would like to mention something about London as a point. But if I may return to Johannes about the idea of the role of judiciary. So the Independent Commission Against Corruption is arguably one of the most important legacy of the British administration for Hong Kong. So in recent years, the appointments of the pro-Beijing commissioners have raised concerns over its independence. So do you expect a further politicization of the commission to serve these factional and political struggles in Beijing?
I think that is inevitable. China's approach has always been to control the people. They believe more in controlling the people than controlling the system. Sensitive positions like the police chief, ICAC, no doubt will come within the radar. And indeed, I think one of the major implications of the NSL is to institutionalize Chinese control. And in the past, the formal channel of China interfering with Hong Kong is limited, occasionally through China Liaison Office. And now with one, you have the presence of the National Security Office in Hong Kong. Not to say that they were not here before, but now they can be formally here with formal power there. And secondly is you have a committee for national affairs or national securities, although it is chaired by the chief executive, which mainly Hong Kong officials there. The key position there is the national advisor. And the national advisor obviously would probably be the one, if not directing how the committee is going to work, will be one with great influence over that. And this committee is going to decide on a whole range of policy matter, and including even approval of who should be the police chief, who should be in charge of this special unit within the police. So we can see that this is institutionalizing China's formal influence in Hong Kong. And no doubt sooner or later, I think it will spill to ICAC. The other trend that is worrying is since last year, we have seen an increase of police power, and police power is further enhanced by the national security law there. And to some extent, you can see some of the frontline police officers, they are thinking now they are the center, their power is almost unrestrained and so on. And that's a very dangerous trend once you have a police force which believe they can do anything, and because the governments need them. And that kind of wide power without accountability will be the best breed for other things like corruption and so on. And also we have a large number of national security people down in Hong Kong. Again, they have wide power, not very transparent. And when they are working in Hong Kong, again, with wide power, no accountability, little transparency, and probably they are even outside the jurisdiction of Hong Kong. That again is the best place for things like corruption and so on. So not only I think that there will be a more control on the ICAC chief, but there might even be a diminishing role for ICAC in the sense that certain areas could well be a sensitive area that is outside their reach.
That's very concerning. Thank you. So since Yichun and Johannes, you both mentioned the idea of sort of foreign responses to this. Let's move on to that. International society's stake in Hong Kong and the national security law. So it's been widely discussed that foreign nationals outside of Hong Kong could face persecution under the law. So this is the Article 38 of the law. Sarah Cook at the Freedom House actually pointed out that national security law is already changing the way that people assess, their travel itineraries, business models, and communication methods, and could unleash a new global wave of self-censorship, in her words. So our understanding is that Article 38 exposed a wide array of individuals to detention and persecution should they travel to Hong Kong. So I want to ask Johannes, what is your assessment of this extraterritorial implication for national security law? What exactly is what is the fundamental legal basis for Article 38? If you could tell us a bit.
Well, a sovereign country could always assert extraterritorial jurisdiction. The question is whether you can enforce it. So to some extent, I think it is more bluff than real. There is not much you can do with foreign nationals outside China. And the real impact really is, I think, more likely to be the Chinese overseas. They are the more risky target. And of course, it has been said that some critical foreigners, if they come to China, Hong Kong, or friendly countries with China, they would be subject to extraditions. And in theory, yes, if those countries are prepared to do that. In practice, I think the risk of foreigners being arrested in a foreign country because of the extraterritorial jurisdiction of China is probably limited. But then we have seen people like Nathan Law, allegedly there is a worldwide warrant of arrest for him. So if people like that kind of dissidents going outside China, and if they happen to be in a country which is very friendly with China, then their risk is much higher than foreigners. And also, it could also mean, I think, when people in Hong Kong or China working with foreigners, sometimes I think it is the foreign friends who might be worried about what happened to those within Hong Kong or China, which is more worrying than really exercise extraterritorial effect. There may be some professionals which are more risky than others, like journalists. We have seen Financial Times have already moved out of Hong Kong. So foreign journalists, the chances of their being not giving visa to come to Hong Kong, cover matters of China, not giving the same privilege as other reporters, I think that is more real than exercising any criminal jurisdiction, although we can't rule it out, as we can see in how they deal with the Canadian diplomats in retaliation to what Canada has done to the extradition request from US.
Right. Dominic Raab, the UK Foreign Secretary, has offered Hong Kong migrants an expedited route to citizenship. And the city of London has also expressed a strong sort of historical and affinity with Hong Kong. So I want to ask Charlie, do you see the UK government doing more with opening capital markets for Hong Kong's potential capital flows? And if so, do you see a tension in London's role in internationalizing the renminbi and Hong Kong's obsolescing value as a financial hub for Chinese capital? So this is the issue that each one has alluded to earlier.
Yeah, good questions. Can I just get back one very briefly on Article 38, where I agree with Johannes that it's not necessarily aimed at those of us abroad, but it does have an effect because it's aimed, I think, particularly at, let's say, abroad, Article 38, Hong Kong students, and that affects the freedom of academic freedom in our country. If Hong Kong students and others, mainland students, are reluctant to speak out in their studies and say things which they're worried about that might run foul of the law, then that really does start to affect the UK in the UK. And I also agree with Johannes that there will be those who are a little worried about foreigners, about some of the things they say and do, and therefore whether they will wish to transit Hong Kong. I personally will not be going back unfortunately, to Hong Kong. And this is, you know, can open a wide debate as to the level of understanding between China and foreigners as these sorts of areas of debate and contact get closed off. Very worrying, I think, and that's a big topic. Yes, I think the question of Hong Kong and its financial role, etc., or the role of London is intimately tied with the internationalization of the RMB. I think that if the RMB is fully internationalized, then Hong Kong days really are numbered, as Johannes talked about the Greater Bay Area plan. But I think that, you know, the Communist Party would be very happy to see most of the financial role shifting to Shenzhen or Shanghai and out of Hong Kong. I don't, however, think that's going to happen, because I don't think that it's realistic for China to internationalize the RMB, certainly not in the next decade or two, despite the amount of talk that there is about that, both in the foreign commentariat and from Beijing itself. And for a start, you've got to open the capital account, almost certainly, and then what happens? There will be a massive capital flight, I suspect, as people diversify, unquote, their holdings. And that means a fall in the housing market, because that's where most value is stored at the moment, which again impacts upon the construction industry, etc., etc. And you can see that just is not going to happen, I don't think, in the near future. So therefore, I think that Hong Kong's role, both as an IPO center and as a channel for China's use of foreign currencies, will continue. It may erode over the years, but I don't see that dropping off immediately. And therefore, as a corollary, I don't necessarily see London, certainly not New York, which isn't politically in favor, but Frankfurt, Paris, Tokyo, and others picking up a massive amount of slack in the short term. And don't forget that London at the moment is not in Beijing's best books. It's interesting to see where the European Union goes on this. Japan is never usually, I mean, is always walking on delicate eggshells vis-a-vis China. So, you know, I don't see this as the immediate death knell of Hong Kong.
Right. Well, just on that point, if I could just turn to Isabel now. So we see the Americans imposing sanctions on individuals, including Carrie Lam, and this is part of, you know, concurrent to what they're doing with officials involved in Xinjiang internment camps and human rights abuses. So Isabel, do you see a widening fracture between Western and Chinese elites, who in the past have been fairly chummy on a lot of issues in seeking sort of win-win outcomes? And would this increasing divide galvanize or hamper a Western support for human rights in Hong Kong and elsewhere?
Well, I think in the short term, we've seen it galvanize support for human rights in Hong Kong, at least in the US administration, which previously had shown remarkably little interest in human rights anywhere. But I think this is, you know, instrumentalizing human rights as part of a wider geostrategic confrontation between the United States and China. And I'm not sure, I mean, I think this has a very long way to play out. And I'm not sure that every move that the US administration has made is going to have quite the effect that it hopes for, including, you know, the tit for tat arrangements over press access, for example. You know, and hitherto administrations like the United States have said, we are not authoritarian countries, and, you know, we have a different view of press freedoms. But increasingly, you've seen the Trump administration restricting press access for Chinese media in the United States, very much as China restricts media access for Western press. And you know, the kind of mutual expulsions, I think, are not helpful. I mean, I think information flows are very important. Hong Kong's been very important for information flows. And you know, kicking journalists out of China and of Hong Kong is actually not good for China, and it's certainly not good for people who are seeking to understand China.
Yes.
Certainly in terms of elite attitudes, we've seen a fracture in the UK in elite attitudes to China. As you've intimated previously, these were very much dominated by business interests. Those business interests have had to go a little quiet lately because there's been a very different political trend, as we've seen, for example, over the reversal of the decision on Huawei's involvement in UK 5G. I would expect also to see quite a lot of pushback from the backbenchers of the Conservative Party, which has close links with the American right wing, to push back against the involvement of China in nuclear power. Now that's going to further damage relations between the UK and China and put, again, pro-business elites into very much kind of on the back foot. So I think at the moment they're staying quiet. On Hong Kong and finance, I think the one function that remains important to China in terms of Hong Kong's financial capacity is channeling investment into China. Now, China needs less of that these days, but it does still need it. So that's a function that I think would have to find a substitute if those flows were to dry up. But the other aspect, which I think is not going to suffer, and Beijing will not let it suffer, is the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. We're going to see a return, again, talking of fractures, we're going to see a return to Hong Kong stock listings of companies, Chinese companies that had listed in the United States. And that's going to create a kind of big boost to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. It's pretty much going to be Chinese listings, but it's going to create the impression of, you know, Hong Kong thriving rather than a collapse in the value of Hong Kong as a financial center. So it's going to be a very complicated and mixed picture, I think, and I don't think we can just assume that an action from Washington is going to have the effect that Washington thinks.
Well, we're going to be taking questions presently, so if I could encourage the audience to please submit your questions now and to mention to whom the question is addressed and your name and affiliation, if that's all right with you. But before we do that, let me just very quickly ask Yichun one question, building on what Isabel is saying, is that in the past, you know, Taiwan has always seen through the lens, in the West at least, of, you know, part of that one country, two systems referencing by Beijing. So now that framework is basically discredited and dismantled. Do you see very quickly, do you see sort of Tsai Ing-wen's government having an opportunity to redefine the reference point for Taiwan's democratic future?
Well, I think in Taiwan, the one country, two system has always been refuted and not accepted by various governments as well as the majority of the people. So to be one country, two system to Taiwan is never something that can be you can start with. And it's always that the Taiwan refused to accept that, and Taiwan has its own future. Taiwanese people should be able to decide their own future, and that's how we value the democracy and the democratic sustainabilities. And I think about the Hong Kong and Taiwan, this issue basically what we see is first of all about the credibility about China, and second, how a democracy of Taiwan that can highlight that this is a better governance model that China and as well Hong Kong should have. So the reference point about the one country two system, the hindsight is that how Taiwan should be incorporated into China. But we think that the analogy should not be like this. It should be which governing system, which value that we should cherish the most, which are the best system for the people. And we believe this is the reference that we like to have.
Great. Well, let's turn to the questions now. We have one specifically for each one and a few for all of us generally. So let me start with a specific one. This is from Professor Prince. Professor Prince asks, with respect to the threshold for willingness of Xi Jinping and his faction to act more aggressively, as you described, how does the panel, how do you and others interpret the expulsion of Professor Cai Xia from the party and the party's central school, reported today in The Guardian, and her sanguine comments on these actions?
You're asking me or asking some others?
If I could start with you, but anyone, you know, feel free to.
Okay, I think that Cai Xia means two things. First of all, Cai Xia is part of the so-called princeling generations, and she has a connection, and also her past profession was in the party school. So she educated a lot of the party elites, especially among the privileged fews. And I think her influence there definitely has resolved something, and that's how scary it is that Xi Jinping views. First of all, if you were to me that the Cai Xia, the public rebellion means that there are substantial number within the governing generation. They do not agree with Xi Jinping. And second, and Xi Jinping, his rule there also has he's not confident about his power base, and that means that for anyone who publicly would like to deny or challenge Xi Jinping's position, that person needs to be expelled quickly.
I see. Right. So preemptive. For Isabel, I think, but generally speaking, we have a question from Chris Whitehouse, White House consultancy and advisor to Fight for Freedom, Stand with Hong Kong. So Chris is wondering if NSL is already corrupting democracies around the world. So he mentioned that police in Hong Kong have briefed that the 3 of the recent arrests were related to alleged support of these arrestees for Fight for Freedom, the organization which is mentioned, Stand with Hong Kong, which in turn had funded the work of the British All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hong Kong in producing a report on breaches of the Hong Kong police on international humanitarian law. So he sees an attempt to intimidate those parliamentarians to back off from their criticisms. What is your view, Isabel, and perhaps Charlie, on this issue?
Well, I don't think it's just the national security law that is having this effect. I think we've seen over the past decade pressure being applied increasingly over what is said, thought and published about China, not just in China, but in the UK and in many other countries. And this pressure has been applied through various ways. This situation renders it, if you like, more visible and more acute because the argument has become louder and more more critical. But the idea that discourse control is new is simply not the case. We have seen, repeated examples of attempts at discourse control, and that's about trying to internationalize China's narrative about itself. So, what the party says and encourages people to think about the party in China needs to be internationalized if China goes global. And that's, the logic of what's happening. So you have a confrontation of narratives, you have as well, it goes along with a confrontation of systems and values. Hong Kong, if you like, is the epicenter of that right now because it's such a clear case of confrontation of values. But it's not new, sadly.
Right. Let me return very briefly to Professor Prince's question and about Xi Jinping and the pressures. I think, Charlie, I think you wanted to say something about that. I'm sorry, I didn't get a chance to call you earlier.
Don't worry, I think it's an interesting question, and I think there's a lot of opposition to Xi Jinping amongst the intelligentsia and the academics. But I think the point that I would make is that Xi Jinping, probably China generally, the party has never paid a great deal of attention to them in terms of altering its policies as a result. So what really matters to the party is whether there's any disunity at the top of the party. That's the lesson they took from the collapse of the Soviet Union's Communist Party. And that won't happen, I don't think, unless there's really bad trouble in China in terms of unrest and the economy. Only at that stage will the party start really fighting against itself, because they know very well that that's the one way that they will all fall together. And if they are, lack of unity, that's the way it'll go. So, Professor Tsai is, I think it will be treated much worse than, although I think she's in America at the moment, than someone like Xu Jiangrun or others, but just because she was at the party school and she was a real insider. But I don't think that this sort of opposition that she represents, this intellectual opposition, is actually going to make a great deal of difference on the ground.
See. Well, here, let me turn to Jonathan Femby, London-based author and a senior China watcher. Jonathan asks, is the international criticism likely to have any impact on the application of the law? May I turn to Johannes first to answer that question?
Yes and no. And international criticism, I think it helps to keep Hong Kong on the international agenda. And also to some extent sustain some of the movement in Hong Kong. I think to that extent it's helpful, but as far as international criticism, how it impact on the law, and I think in the interpretation of the NSL, some particularly comes from very credible organization, might be taken into consideration. Comments like from the Human Rights Committee under the ICCPR, especially when ICCPR is expressly referred to in the NSL. I think that sort of things could be of assistance if we are talking about interpretation. And here, I think I can allude to a point which Charlie mentioned earlier, is the impact of the NSL on the judiciary. And we can see a trend of distrusting the judiciary from the days when they talk about judges should be patriotic to the day they give interpretation instructing how the court is going to deal with the oath case, to more recently in the NSL, they take away the power of judicial review over certain things, and in some provisions it seems that they're taking away discretion of the courts, and let alone the designation of a particular group of judges to try this type of cases. So the message keeps coming back is judges are being watched, and if necessary, they will always be resort back to the power of interpretation. So I think that poses great restraint on the judiciary. I have no doubt that our judges are still independent, but the space that they can work with is tightening up. But having said that, I think it is now for the judiciary to try to resort to more ingenuity in making sense of the NSL. I think there are still room to play around with the interpretation, bringing NSL, reading it together with the basic law, reading it together with the ICCPR, and come up with something short of challenging the constitutionality of the NSL, but nonetheless imbue some common law values into it. And in this regard, I think comments from jurists particularly, and judicial or quasi-judicial organs on this sort of things, I think that could be taken into account in helping the court to shape the way, or at least to minimize the adverse impact of the law.
That's a very constructive understanding. Thank you. Now, may I turn to Yichun? We have a question from Gunnar Rekvik. His question is that considering Taiwan is now feeling pressure, could there also be a resurgence of hostilities with Japan over the Senkaku Diaoyu Island claims?
I think we definitely saw a lot of activity coming from China, especially on the military side, harassing Taiwan. And in comparison with the Chinese activity in the year 2018, year 2019, the frequency and intensity of those activities increased several folds. So yes, the tension across the Taiwan Straits is rising significantly, and we are working our butts off trying to meet those challenges. And but the challenge is not just to Taiwan itself. Yes, you are right that the Chinese activity in Senkaku also increased quite significantly. We do notice that the Chinese naval as well as the Coast Guard ship has been in the proximity or even in the proximal waters just outside the 12 miles of the Senkaku Islands, been there for continue over 100 days. This never happened before, which means that the Chinese pressure is not just about Taiwan, goes to Japan, and since this April, China also started the so-called Beihai 2020 operation, which basically is a Coast Guard operation to proclaim the Chinese sovereignty over those 9-9 areas, and by expelling other countries' fishermen boats and driving out of those areas. And of course, we saw the June, the China and India, they have the border dispute and also result to the bloodshed that we never seen that in like the last 20 years. So the overall Chinese activity has been more violent and more assertiveness. So we just cannot see that just in terms of one single area. But basically, I think this is overall Chinese posture to the peripheries.
Thank you. On that point, I'm afraid that we'll have to bring this to a close. I want to thank Isabel Hilton, Johannes Chen, Yichun Lai, and Charlie Parton for offering incisive and best informed insights into this turning point in the political future of Hong Kong and democratic movements in the region and around the world. To bring a close to the Hong Kong's future under China's national security law, I'd like to thank the audience for your excellent questions and apologize to those of you whose question I didn't get a chance to select for a discussion. We'll certainly be continuing to pay attention to developments in Hong Kong in future Center for Geopolitics blogs and seminars. Please visit our website, www.cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk for recorded webinars and announcements in the future events. For now, that's all from all of us at the Center for Geopolitics. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.